Commandeering Washington, DC. Welcome to Law and Society. Please subscribe. And let's talk about what's happening with the federal forces coming onto the streets of Washington, DC. I will preface this by saying that by definition, what's happening in DC is not commandeering because DC is not a state. And so it's a very weird sort of a dynamic where the National Guard of DC is controlled by Congress, and there's the commander of the National Guard of DC is the President of the United States. But when it comes to city governance, the mayor and the city council have the power. And so what Attorney General of the United States Pam Bondi did was essentially change the leadership of the police force by appointing the commissioner of the DEA to be the police commissioner of DC Police, and then directed the city or directed the police force to stop their sanctuary city policies when it comes to immigration policies. And if you go back and you think about the sanctuary city policy, it goes back to the April 28th executive order that goes after sanctuary jurisdictions. And, you know, Donald Trump started out testing his police state after April 28th by sending out some federal agents, DHS agents, then sending out his unmarked brown shirts into LA. But LA is part of the state of California. It has a city government. It has a state government. He knew that he couldn't commandeer any police force there. So what he did was he bypassed the Governor Newsom, and had the National Guard order the National Guard head, the commander in California, to notify the governor and then deploy the troops. And now they're contesting that in court, whether notifying the governor as opposed to coming order to the National Guard coming through the governor was violation of violation of the law. It goes beyond the powers of the federal government and goes into the state authority where the governor of California has command over the National Guard of California. So what happened in this situation here is, first of all, this is a great case for DC statehood, because DC has more people than the state of Vermont and the state of Wyoming. So why shouldn't DC have a representative government of at least one representative and 2 senators? That's what Wyoming has. That's what Vermont has. So why not DC? Because the federal government couldn't do this to DC that it is doing and still be able to carry out these enforcements and force the city government in any ways they can until this issue is litigated. The leeway is much further in the District of Columbia, in Washington, D.C., than it is in any other state. So Mayor Bowser issued a statement on X saying, "Let us be clear about what the law requires during a presidential declared emergency. It requires the mayor of Washington, D.C. to provide the services of the Metropolitan Police Department for federal purposes at the request of the president." So you see here, Pam Bondi, somebody who's been delegated power through from the president, is directly going to the police and ordering and the rescission of their immigration sanctuary city laws, as well as then changing the command of DC police. And so, Mayor Bowser said that, we have followed the law based on the Home Rule Act. And in reference to the Attorney General's order, there is no statute that conveys the district's personnel authority to a federal official. So that it says that there's no authority in law that allows the federal government to come in and take over DC's personnel, people, that the police department. Because they cannot use the anti-commandeering laws that have been implemented over the years, and I'll briefly talk about them after I go over what the Attorney General of the District of Columbia said. Attorney General Brian Schwab argues that Pam Bondi's orders hours earlier naming an emergency police commissioner and vacating district rules limiting local police cooperation with immigration authorities could not be followed by the city's police force. The memo for the police chief, Pamela Smith, said local officers must continue to follow her orders over Bondi's under Schwab's interpretation of the law, setting up a potential legal clash between heavily Democratic district and a Republican administration. That's a little bit of partisan reporting you have there. I think that came from Associated Press. The point is that Bondi is trying to go in and violate the Home Rule Act. And in the memo that the Attorney General of District of Columbia sent to the city police of District of Columbia, it says that, in my opinion, the Bondi order is unlawful and that you are not legally obligated to follow it. Section 740 of the Home Rule Act provides the president with the authority to direct the mayor to provide services of the Metropolitan Police Department in order to address special circumstances of an emergency nature and for federal purposes. So the mayor has to do the directing. It doesn't authorize the president or his delegee, in this case Pam Bondi, to remove or replace the chief of police or to alter the chain of command within the Metropolitan Police Department, to demand services directly from you, the Metropolitan Police Department, or anyone other than the mayor, to rescind or suspend police orders or directives, or to set general enforcement priorities for the police, or otherwise determine how the district pursues purely local law enforcement. So, therefore, the Bondi order goes beyond the authority of the Attorney General of the United States or the President of the United States, because according to the Home Rule Act, that power lies with the mayor, and the mayor activates that power through the president, activates the power when the president asks the mayor to do so. So that's where the legal story lies with what is happening with DC in terms of putting out the police. Then there's the federal enforcement coming in, right? Then you have DHS coming into federal into DC jurisdiction and performing law enforcement function. You have FBI agents walking around DC performing police functions. That, however, would, in any other state, these would constitute violation of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So, if there is no direct, generally applicable law that applies to the states and to everybody that's federal, that through the supremacy clause the federal government can have. But if there are areas that are not legislated, if there are areas of governance that states have in their state sovereignty that is not part of the U.S. Constitution, or thereby any other federal laws coming through via the U.S. Constitution, legislated through Congress, you cannot go into those state rights, because they become state rights, and you going and encroaching on state law where there's no federal law that's being violated. The states have the right to govern themselves. State laws are to be followed as the first line of defense when you are a resident of a state. So in this commandeering story, despite the fact that it's not legally commandeering because DC is not a state, what Donald Trump is doing is commandeering, which refers to federal government actions which would force the state government to take some action that it would otherwise not take. So if DC were a state, which is why DC should be a state, the public policy and public interest argument here is strong, because we are seeing what the federal government is doing, and is nobody's there to stop what they're doing unless they go to the courts, and then the courts stop the federal government based on the Home Rule Act and not based on anti-commandeering law, despite the fact that it is exactly the same as commandeering of states, to which, Justice Scalia said the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems or command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. It matters not whether policymaking is involved, and no case-by-case weighing of the burdens or benefits is necessary. Such commands are fundamentally incompatible with our constitutional system of dual sovereignty. So here, if DC were a state, this would become relevant. This would become a sure shot way to stop the federal government from encroaching. But it is not, because DC is not a state. And so DC has to rely on the Home Rule Act, and DC at this point is helpless in getting federal agents and federal troops out of their district. If DC were a state, then that would be possible to do. You could get the federal government out, or Donald Trump wouldn't even have tried to do it, because he hasn't tried to commandeer any of the forces anywhere in the other states. And in his executive order on April 28th, he actually talked about police officers going after criminals and then them being immunized, and somehow them having sort of immunity, qualified immunity for aiding federal forces. That was something that was in the executive order memo that Bondi was supposed to figure out in the last 3 months. And because they were not able to figure that out, how they were going to commandeer state resources like state police or city police officers to help them with ICE raids, which is why it blew up in their faces and they couldn't do it in LA. Well, they don't have that problem in DC. That was the answer that Bondi had. From Bondi's head came this idea that, well, we don't have that problem with DC. Any anti-commandeering law, any sort of law that would prohibit us from essentially taking away the resources of the city of Washington, D.C., would not face the huge hurdle of commandeering that Donald Trump would have faced had he tried to force any of the city or state officials to follow ICE detention procedures or detention procedures based on sanctuary cities and his executive orders from April 28th. And then he has added the going after homeless people and mentally ill people in his late July executive order. And that's why you saw DC preemptively removing and listening to Donald Trump and starting to move homeless people off of the District of Columbia. Where these homeless people are going to go, what their life is going to be like, nobody knows. Donald Trump doesn't know. His executive order doesn't know. I don't know how the government of Washington, D.C., the city council and the mayor are going to reconcile that, how they're going to reconcile the wrangling of mentally ill people, and then how they're going to reconcile the Home Rule Act with, essentially breaching the Home Rule Act and breaking that law and telling the police department of D.C. to help federal agents carry out illegal raids, immigration raids, and arbitrary detentions for homeless and mentally ill people. Where do you stop when you go after, the LGBT community? That's what I think about. Then you go about places where women gather, women's organizations and ban them. Then you specifically target the trans community. You don't know how far that goes. But you see that in DC, Donald Trump can do that. And that is an intimidation tactic by Donald Trump. Because not every lay person is going around asserting that, he can't do that here because this is a city and the city has its own government and they have their own laws and this is part of state sovereignty. The state will assert that the federal government doesn't have the power to come in and do this. But DC is not a state. And Brutus is an honorable man. With that said, thank you so much for listening. I hope you will like, share, and subscribe. But more importantly, I hope you will start thinking about pushing on the statehood issue of Washington, D.C. And also keep an eye on the ever overreaching and encroaching federal government that will try its best to go after sanctuary cities based on the executive order from April. Even if they cannot enlist local forces, by then Donald Trump is going to have his DHS ICE mega force that he has got billions of dollars to fill the ranks with. So now you're also slowly probably going to stop seeing the military coming out or Donald Trump relying on the National Guard because he's just going to send out these DHS agents on, general patrolling, on federal missions, on executive order missions, interim orders. There's no specific law, or there is specific law like immigration law, and we're going to go into the states and we're going to break through state sovereignty, and then they're going to hit this commandeering problem at some point. But as a test case for the show of force, first bringing the tanks into DC for Donald Trump's birthday, then seeing the sort of visual of the police force being there while the ICE raids are going on in LA, and there is the general pushback from the law, the violation of due process of law, from the individual standpoint. And then you also see the state pushing back on saying, no, you cannot just deploy the National Guard, you have to go through the governor, and that's also in litigation. But in DC, all of those things are not there. So to the lay person, it shows the vast, unrestricted power of the federal government to hold a city hostage. So all of a sudden, other cities start reeling back. It wouldn't be surprised if there are cities that, automatically rescind their sanctuary city provisions. You never know. You never know. You never know if states, the red states, help and they actually allow their states' resources to go towards these federal purposes or to go towards these illegal purposes, because there's no law that says you have to arrest and confine homeless and mentally ill people. That's purely by Donald Trump's executive order in July. But in these states, federal authority will be extended through state powers as well, because they are red states and they will listen to Donald Trump. And big blue cities in those red states are going to have a really hard time. The courts are going to become the place where they're going to get to go to contest that they are, encroaching, that's federal government encroaching on state sovereignty when they're going after those cities. You may actually have states say, no, we are going to waive that state sovereignty. How that's going to go, I don't know. Is state sovereignty waivable? You just go down that road of whether in a red state with a blue city or a blue locality, you don't have this overreaching commandeering happen, but even in the courts, you don't find recourse because your state is not standing with you. Then where would you find the power in the city, from the city government? Would you find it in the 9th Amendment that says unenumerated powers are vested to the people? Like, where would you put that? Where would you put that? Because the state isn't helping you, and you are a blue demographic, and Donald Trump's executive orders are targeting you. So in order to challenge the constitutionality of those, my first goal would be to challenge the constitutionality of the 3 executive orders that are unconstitutional. The sanctuary city order, the establishing of a police state in going and with criminal aliens as the pretext, then homeless and mentally ill as the pretext. So, I'm going around in circles now, but that's my point, is this overreach, and DC is the pilot program of the federal overreach of Donald Trump's authoritarian regime, and we need to pay attention, we need to push back, we need to stand with citizens of DC, and we need to really push our state authorities to make noise about this before it even starts happening. Start talking about how if that comes to us, that's illegal because that's commandeering. Start doing that now, because that will double as a campaign, not only for you saying that they are usurping state, they're going to come and commandeer, but it's also going to lift up the cause for statehood of an area that has more people than the state of Vermont and the state of Wyoming to get representation in Congress through a representative, through two senators in Congress, and therefore have the power to stop the federal government at its door, as close as it may be, and curb the jurisdiction of the federal government in Washington, D.C. Because Americans live in Washington, D.C. and they need representation. And this only, Donald Trump's police state only exaggerates why. Thank you for listening. Take care.